Hello, everyone. For those I missed earlier this afternoon, welcome. I'm Belle Gerlich, and I'm the Dean of the Libraries here at Texas Tech. I hope the end of this first day of the conference has you feeling excited about literature, community, and the natural world, and you're eager to learn more. Right now, we'd like to take this opportunity to express our immense thanks to the donor of the newest collection to the Southwest Collection Special Collections Library, Mr. Stephen Small. The Stephen J. Small Conservation Collection comprises more than 200 books that have been integral to creating and shaping the conservation movement in the United States throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Some of the best-known authors in the collection include Edward Abbey, William Burroughs, Rachel Carlson, A.B. Guthrie, Aldo Leopold, and Henry David Thoreau. Mr. Small is recognized as the nation's leading authority on private land protection options and strategies. He studied journalism and earned his bachelor's in English from Yale University and his master's in journalism from Northwestern University. After graduation, he moved to Washington, D.C., where he was a political reporter during the day while going to school to earn his law degree at night. Author of the Federal Tax Law of Conservation Easements and Preserving Family Lands, Book 1, Book 2, and Book 3, as well as his latest book, The Business of Open Space, What's Next. Mr. Small also wrote the Federal Income Tax Regulation on Conservation Easements as attorney advisor in the Office of Chief Counsel of the Internal Revenue Service. He never thought he would be doing what he is doing, but found his niche in land conservation. Mr. Small, we are glad you found your niche and are most grateful to you for your generous donation. The Stephen J. Small Conservation Collection is a wonderful fit here, and we are proud to be its home. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Stephen Small.
I thought we could start off by shocking everyone. Here's one of the books in my collection. For those of you who can't see it, Donald Trump, The Art of the Deal, and it's inscribed, and by the end of the presentation, you'll understand why it's here today. If not understand why, while I'm here today. Thanks for that great introduction. I've always liked to write, but I didn't know I liked tax law until I went to night law school. And in my last year of night law school, I wanted to write a paper on where the tax code intersected with historic preservation. And there's almost nowhere where the tax code intersects with historic preservation. But one area was and continues to be historic preservation easements on historic buildings. And I wrote a paper on that, and as I was writing it, I found, and in fact, one of the reasons I started in the first place was that there was almost no good literature at all out there on that subject. This is 1978. Preservation easements were very new to the tax code, and I thought, you know, if I really work hard at this paper, I can turn out a good paper and get it published, which of course is every law student's goal, to get something published. And again, fortunately, I had always liked to write, and I knew I was a good writer, and I wrote a great paper, and it got published in 2 different law journals, which was a real kick for me. The teacher gave me a B, but that's all history. I went from night law school to the Internal Revenue Service in Washington, D.C. I was in Chief Counsel's office. My job was writing regulations, and one of the projects that was sitting on my desk when I got there was a project to write regulations on the conservation easement statute that had passed in 1976. And a dear friend of ours says, the obstacles fall away from the path you're supposed to follow, and there it was waiting for me. For those of you who don't know a lot about conservation easements, let me just take 2 or 3 minutes to describe that. As a landowner, you have the right to do anything you want with your property, subject to public health and zoning and safety regulations. You can put up a 40-story office building. You can cut down all the trees, you can plant trees, you can farm it or ranch it. With a conservation easement, it's a recorded legal document. It runs with the land in perpetuity, and you give up most of those development rights. In other words, a conservation easement really says, I like this piece of land the way it is, and I want to freeze it more or less like this going into the future. It doesn't really freeze it. You can continue to farm it. You can continue to ranch it. I say to landowners a lot, the most important way I describe a conservation easement is that it prevents pavement on your property. It keeps the bulldozers away. One of the interesting things about my field, and I'm going to talk about my field and then get into the collection, is that there's an interesting coming together of public awareness where people began to realize that that zoning map up on the wall wasn't worth the paper it was written on. Because one year it could say, this is zoned rural, this is zoned agricultural, and the next year it could say, this is zoned residential, this is zoned commercial, and 5 years after that it could say, this is zoned industrial. So if you own land and you care about what happens to it in the future, you can't rely on local zoning. And in some jurisdictions, they're a little better about that than others, but by and large, that's a pretty safe generalization. So a conservation easement is almost like private zoning. You're saying, this is a farm, this is a ranch, I love it this way, and it's always going to stay this way. And they're enforceable in all 50 states in perpetuity. A land trust, the organization, you write the easement, you record the easement, you essentially give it to a charitable organization or government agency. You're not really giving them the development rights, you're giving them the right to enforce the conservation easement against you and any future owner. So they're really in a monitoring and enforcement capacity. We've had a tremendous growth in the conservation easement and land trust business over the last 30 years in this country. And I'm happy to say that I think one of the reasons for that growth was the first book I wrote, which was my first Preserving Family Lands book. Let me talk a little bit more about my own career, and then I'll seg into the collection stuff. I left the IRS in '82. So I like to say I was the nation's leading authority on conservation easements, but nobody cared at that point. And there was a lot of truth to that. I went into private practice in Boston, and I was an all-purpose tax lawyer. I did corporate work, I did partnership work, I did audits and so forth. I think in the first 5 years I was practicing law in Boston, I had maybe 2 conservation easement matters to deal with, and this is the 1980s. At the end of 1987, I attended a program up on the North Shore of Boston for landowners, and it was aimed at landowners who cared about their land. And here was the issue. The issue was that land, for the first time ever, was becoming so valuable that it was colliding with the estate tax. The estate tax threshold in 1987 was $600,000. You could leave $600,000 without paying any estate tax. There were dairy farmers in Vermont that owned farms near the interstate that were worth $1 million. They weren't worth $1 million as dairy farms. They were worth $1 million as subdivisions. And for the first time in the history of the United States, the family that just wanted to leave its land to the children couldn't do that anymore. It had to be sold to pay the estate tax. And it was fortuitous timing, the combination of conservation easements, the change in the mindset of a lot of landowners. You say to landowners all across this country, I'll bet you, and I do this all the time when I speak, I'll bet you don't like anybody telling you what to do with your land. And wherever I go, they all nod and they say, oh yeah, he understands how we think. Well, they think that way all over the country. If you don't like anybody telling you what to do with your land, you'd better put a conservation easement on it. Because if you don't,
The government is going to tell your heirs they have to sell that land, and they're not going to like what they hear. So I did this program on conservation easements with a couple of other panelists, and one of the women who put the program together, wonderful lady, she could be a real nag, it got things done, and she kept saying, Stephen, don't you have something simple and easy we can hand out to landowners that explains this? No such thing existed. There was no simple, easy literature on conservation easements. And I thought, well, you know, I can write a series of memos. I thought, like a tax lawyer, I can write a series of memos. And I started to write a series of memos, and I thought, you know, I got enough memos. If I staple them together and put a cover on it and try and make it a little bit more personal, then it's a book. And that became Preserving Family Lands. My law office stood behind the first printing of 4,000 copies of that first edition of that book. We sold 4,000 copies at $2 each, like that, and recovered all our costs. This has all been self-publishing. The law firm stood behind that, but I've funded them since then. I thought when we printed 4,000 copies, I thought my parents were going to end up with 500 of them, and they ended up all around the country. Land trusts, the Jackson Hole Land Trust, the Virginia Outdoors Foundation, the Brandywine Conservancy. These were some of the early groups that bought 200 copies of Preserving Family Lands at $2 a copy and gave them away to people. And then they bought another 200, and then they bought another 200. So we sold the 4,000, and we printed another 4,000, and we sold those, and we printed another 6,000, and we sold those. And I said, gee, I think maybe I'm on to something. Because I had never, ever anticipated that I could make a living doing work in this field. And what the books did, the books got into circulation and people started to call me. And that was in 1988, 1989, and I don't get that many phone calls now. I get a lot of emails instead. That was before email. And I've done conservation projects in all 50 states. I've been in 46 states. I've worked with some of the most remarkable landowners in this country and seen some of the most beautiful land. And it was after one of those very, very early projects, and I don't even remember which project it was, but we completed a project. It was a complicated project. This is back around 1990. And I was really proud of that. And I said, you know what, I'm going to go out at lunch and buy myself a present. And I wasn't really sure what I was going to buy, you know, whether it was going to be a nice bottle of wine or a new tie. And right downtown Boston was one of the old book dealers. And I wandered in there and I said to the boss, I said, you know, do you have any good environmental books here that I could buy? And he pulled off the shelf a first edition of Silent Spring with a ripped cover. Now, those of you who know anything about book collecting know that if there's a ripped cover on it, it's lost whatever percent of its value. He said, you can have this for $100 because it's got a ripped cover. And I bought it. And I brought it back to the office, and it talked to me. And it sat there on my bookshelf, and I said, you know, this is really nice stuff. And I started to go to book shows, and I started to get catalogs, and I started to deal with some of the prominent dealers around the country. One of the people I dealt with the most over the years was Ken Lopez, who may be known to many of you. I know he has a very good collection with the college here. And in fact, it was Ken when I finally decided I had to divest my collection because we were downsizing. I said, what am I going to do with this collection? He said, let me make a phone call to Texas. I said, what's in Texas? And anyway, here we are. So that's the background of how I started the collection. It's hard to bring order out of this collection because I collected environmental books, but I got to define what that meant. I have a college classmate who's had the world's premier collection of Rudyard Kipling. So that, you know, that's easy, okay, Rudyard Kipling, but what does an environmental collection mean? So I've sort of divided up the collection into three major groups and some subgroups, and I want to talk a little bit about each one of those here. I also particularly want to spend time on a couple of items in the collection with which I have a personal connection. And those, I call those my war stories. And that was also very helpful to me during my career, because wherever I'd travel, if I got involved with anyone or any group and there was a local book or someone had published a book, I always made sure I got something like that for my collection. So the three big categories. The first big category is probably the usual suspects, the core traditional environmental group, ranging from Thoreau and Carson and Muir and Burroughs and Aldo Leopold and on and on. I don't have any personal connections with any of those. And they're modern contemporaries, like Barry Lopez and like Carrie Tempest Williams and Gretel Ehrlich and McKibben and W.S. Merwin. W.S. Merwin actually came to my office maybe 30 years ago because he wanted to protect his land on Hawaii, and he couldn't find any other lawyer who understood the question. Most lawyers, especially in those days, if you had a beautiful piece of land and you said, I want to protect it and I don't want to see it developed, they'd say, what are you talking about? You're giving up enormous value by giving up the development rights. They didn't get it, that people loved their land. And so it really took a while for this discipline to take hold. I've got some of McPhee's books, a couple of more environmental connections, and reaching out to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and even William O. Douglas, and that's sort of the core environmental material. And we could spend hours going over these, but I assure you we won't. I know I have a time allotment here. But I want to point out a couple of the things from my perspective that I really think are some of the highlights of the collection. And one of them is, this is a letter from President Theodore Roosevelt dated 1908, inviting someone to attend the first national conference on the conservation of natural resources. And this is not, again, typical book collector stuff, but when I saw this, I said, I've got to have that for my collection. Another one that is, again, not typical, and this isn't it, but this is part of it, is the original cover art for Silent Spring. And I've got some of the sketches and so forth. And I have also, let's see, this one here. This one here is a first edition of Silent Spring, and it's signed by Rachel Carson on the date of publication. And if you're a collector, you know how important that is. And it's to Marie, with gratitude for our 14 years of friendship and all it has meant, devotedly, Rachel. Marie was her literary agent. Ken Lopez, again, the book dealer and colleague that I dealt with, said that usually the best copy of a book is the one that's owned by the person to whom the book is dedicated. And Silent Spring was dedicated to Albert Schweitzer, and if any such copy exists, nobody knows about it. And he said, so this is probably the best copy extant. I also have a couple of other Carsons inscribed. We've got The Sea Around Us, inscribed to the trustees of the Eugene F. Saxton Memorial Foundation. They helped fund some of that. And I've got an inscribed Under the Sea Wind to Elsie Strom, who was a newspaper reporter, I think, that spent a lot of time following her around. I have probably 22 items, Carson items in the collection. And obviously those mean a lot to me. I didn't realize when I bought the first edition inscribed on the date of publication, I knew it was a first edition inscribed on the date of publication, but I didn't know who Marie was at that point. And the dealer that sold it to me wasn't aware of what he had. So I got it at a really good price. One one more reference under this core environmental authors, and I'll come back to this reference later. It starts with a guy named Ben Pierce, who was the state director for the Wyoming Nature Conservancy 30 years ago. And I knew Ben through my work. And he invited me to a board meeting of the Nature Conservancy of Wyoming in Cody, Wyoming. And one of the guest speakers was Dr. David Love. Dr. David Love is the fellow about whom, more or less, Rising from the Plains by John McPhee is written. He's the dean of the geologists in the state of Wyoming. And it turned out I subsequently had to hire him to consult with me on a Wyoming project. And I said, I'd love a copy of your book. And he said, wait a minute. He said, do I know you from somewhere? And I said, I'm not sure. He said, were you at that Wyoming Nature Conservancy meeting in Cody, Wyoming? And I said, yes, I was. So we exchanged inscribed books to each other. But I'm going to come back to the Ben Pierce connection later. The second category, so the first category is kind of the classics, the core environmental stuff that no one would probably say, why do you have one of those in your collection? Okay, some of the other stuff, again, has more personal connections. I would call it the Edward Abbey, Dave Foreman, Doug Peacock, and Related Matters collection, and what else that led me to. I read Monkey Wrench Gang a long time ago. That came out in 1975. And for those of you, you probably know about it. It's a portrayal of four eco-terrorists, more or less. One of them modeled after Dave Foreman and another after Doug Peacock. And it was a book that really, I think, was way ahead of its time. And I've got some Abbeys, and I've got some Foremans, and I've got some Peacocks in the collection. Part of the personal story is that I ended up having a meeting in the bar at the Tucson airport with Dave Foreman and a bunch of his Wild Earth Wildlands Project colleagues back in 1990. And I'll come back to that story in the bar in a minute. But one of the things that association led me to was Dave published Books of the Big Outside, which is his list of required reading if you're interested in the environment and wilderness and things like that. And that introduced me to A.B. Guthrie Jr., who I was a writer with whom I had not previously been familiar. And A.B. Guthrie Jr. wrote The Way West and Fair Land, and The Big Sky. And one of the things that I really like in my collection is the Big Sky connections. And I'll just grab one of these. This is of the first edition of the Big Sky. 500 copies have been signed by the author for American booksellers and reviewers. This is copy number 84. Okay, and it's signed by A.B. Guthrie Jr., and we'll just set that aside for a moment. I also have another Big Sky that's signed by A.B. Guthrie Jr. and inscribed in July of 1947 to a fellow from the area, and it's signed A.B. Guthrie, Choteau, Montana. For those of you who speak French, it looks like it's Choteau, but that's not how they pronounce it in Montana. It's Choteau. And that's where he did a lot of his writing, up in that area. And I had that, again, that one's July 1947. Well, in August 1997, 50 years later, my wife and I and our two little girls were celebrating our 25th anniversary at Pine Butte Guest Ranch in Choteau, Montana. That's the Nature Conservancy's guest ranch. And one of the folks from the staff said, you know, Carol Guthrie, A.B. Guthrie's widow, is going to be here for dinner later this week. And I called my secretary and I said, send me one of those Big Sky books, quick. and she sent it overnight. So I have an A.B. Guthrie in Choteau, Montana, July 1947, and I have to Steve Small with my best wishes, Carol Guthrie, Pine Butte Guest Ranch, August 1997. Almost 50 years to the day. But that's not the end of my big sky stories. I recently updated my inventory of my books and put a little more commentary in this one. I have a fourth big sky inscribed by A.B. Guthrie to Margaret McElderry. Some of you may know of her. She was in the publishing business in New York, did a lot of children's books. Apparently the story is that Margaret and A.B. Guthrie were working on a children's book version of The Big Sky, and I honestly don't know whether that never materialized. But when I saw that book in the catalog, I laughed out loud and bought it. Margaret McElderry was a client of mine. She came to me through her lawyer in New York City, who knew that she owned some land on Nantucket that she wanted to protect. And he put me in touch with her, and we talked on the phone, and we corresponded, and she said, I'm going to be in Nantucket next month. Let's come down and talk business. So I flew over to the island, and I met with her in the morning, and then I went out and did some other stuff, and she said, come back in the evening, around 5 o'clock, we'll be having drinks, and you can say hello. And she said, if we're not at the house, we're down the beach. So they weren't at the house, and I went down the beach, and there was about 4 or 5 people in a circle, including Margaret. And she introduced me to David Halberstam, who was one of the people in the circle. And Margaret said, Steve does land conservation work. And Halberstam said, that's really interesting. He said, my wife's family has got some land in North Dakota, and we were just out in Jackson, Wyoming, and someone gave me a little book on land conservation. And I said, were you at the Jackson Hole Land Trust? And he said, yes. And I said, was that Story Clark? He said, yes. I said, was that Preserving Family Lands? He said, yes. I said, I wrote that book. And he said, that's your book? And I was about to say, and Dave, what do you do for a living? But I bit my tongue. So those are my, you follow the thing from the meeting in the bar in Tucson to meeting David Halberstam on the beach in Nantucket, and there are interesting connections. Let's go back to the bar in the Tucson airport for a moment. What got me there was a New England lady from a big New England family, and she and her siblings had done a very important conservation easement in New Hampshire. And she had a ranch in Wyoming, and she swapped that ranch for a ranch down in Patagonia, Arizona, the southernmost part of Arizona on the Mexico border, the San Rafael Valley. And she said, Stephen, she said, these people down here don't know anything about conservation easements. You've got to come talk to them. And so I went down there, and that was when I also, somehow in our conversations, the name Dave Foreman came up. She was a bit of a radical herself. I mentioned Dave Foreman, and she laughed, and she said, I know Dave. She said he stayed in my house in Jackson when the FBI was looking for him. So I'll leave her last name out of the rest of the story. But she said, you've got to come down here and talk to these folks in the valley. At dinner one night in the San Rafael Valley, I sat next to an 82-year-old rancher who thought that Barry Goldwater was a communist. But he didn't want any damn real estate developers in his valley. And he didn't want any damn condominia in his valley. And so even though our politics might have been quite different, we had similar views about the right of a private landowner in this country to protect his or her land. I also met with Bobby Sharp and the Sharp family. They had the largest ranch in the San Rafael Valley at that point, 20,000 acres. It was threatened by the estate tax. We came up with a plan. He couldn't get his siblings to agree. The ranch ended up having to be sold when Mother died. But the good news is the core of the ranch is now the San Rafael State Natural Area. And there's an old house, a big old ranch house where they filmed a number of Western movies. The siblings couldn't agree, so the property got sold out of the family, which segs me into my next collection, which is much narrower, really, and it's my South Carolina collection. The first matter that brought me to South Carolina in 1988, in the end, involved some siblings who couldn't agree about what to do with the property that Mother owned, and a huge lawsuit after Mother's death. The property is still protected, so that's really very good news. But I don't have anything in my collection about that one because I also got sued. And the lawyers have said, don't ever say anything else about that ever again because you don't want to bring that up. But I do have in here one of my favorite places in the country and one of the most remarkable pieces of property is Midway Plantation. That's about 6,900 acres, less than an hour outside of Charleston. And it was owned in the early 1990s by a woman named Gertie Legendre. And I met with Gertie in March of 1990, and she had an interesting past. She was the first U.S. woman to be arrested by the Germans in World War II as a spy. And she subsequently escaped to Switzerland and ended up in South Carolina. But she has a biography here, The Time of My Life, to Stephen Small with Hopes for the Preservation, Success of Midway, Gertrude Legendre, March 31st, 1990. I did some wonderful work in South Carolina, some of the major landowners down there, and it actually stands as an example of how the conservation easement business started to take off in this country. There were still people, and maybe there still are, there certainly were in Texas, I know that, who thought that conservation easements were a communist plot. And that thinking has changed, and a lot of ranchers and farmers and big forest landowners understand how important it is to keep their land intact. But in those days, this is 1990, this was really very new stuff. And I worked with both Gertie Legendre, who was the matriarch of Charleston society for decades, and Peter Manigault, whose family owned the Charleston Post and Courier paper. And he had a plantation in South Carolina, and he had a ranch in Sheridan, Wyoming, and he had some historic property in Charleston. And I think what happened in South Carolina, or part of what happened, was when the good citizens of South Carolina, many of whom were major landowners, saw Gertie Legendre putting a conservation easement on her property and Peter Manigault putting a conservation easement on his property, they must have thought, gee, maybe this is not such a bad thing after all. So the last reference in South Carolina, and I don't have a book, but this is a very interesting coincidence. Who knows what Saturday is this Saturday? It's Earth Day. This Saturday is Earth Day. I've given a lot of speeches over the years, and very, very few times have I recognized anybody famous, at least famous from outside the conservation field, in any of my speeches. One of them was Bill Parcells, former New York and Boston football coach, came to one of my speeches. And the other one, on Earth Day in 1990, I gave a speech on Wadmalaw Island, right outside of Charleston, and I looked down there, and 10 feet in front of me was General William Westmoreland. And he was famous then and still is now. For those of you who are too young to remember, he was commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, I think 1964 to 1968, and a very familiar name and face to certainly anybody my age. My definition of elderly goes up a little bit each year. And I remember how I started that speech on Wadmalaw, and I want to share this with you. I started off, I said, it's Earth Day. What are you going to do about the rainforests in Brazil? And I said, that didn't strike a very responsive chord, did it? It's Earth Day. What are you going to do about the spotted owl in Oregon? That didn't strike a very responsive chord either. It's Earth Day. What are you going to do about preserving the quality of life here on Wadmalaw Island? What are you going to do about protecting the open space and protecting the vistas and protecting the history here on Wadmalaw Island? My point is that land conservation, private land conservation in this country, in the end is local. The strength of the private land conservation movement in this country is its grassroots nature. So, let's see, with the time, well, one more just side observation. Westmoreland is an interesting seg. This is not an environmental book, but I don't know how many of you are familiar with the book Matterhorn, the Vietnam War by Karl Marlantes. It hit the New York Times bestseller list with a favorable page 1 review. And Karl and I were good buddies in college. And we became even closer buddies after college when he got back from Vietnam. And so I've followed his career very closely, and I probably have the world's leading collection of Marlantes inscribed manuscripts and ephemera and stuff like that. And it's probably the world's leading collection because nobody else probably collects Marlantes. But I have to decide what to do with that. I'm not ready to divest yet. In fact, I'm going to see him, God willing, in about 6 weeks at our, I have a hard time saying this, our 50th college reunion. And I'm going to ask him if it's okay, finally, if I give away his stuff. But I've talked to Diane about maybe ending up here. Although a classmate of mine I know has now made an inquiry with Beinecke Rare Book Library at Yale to see if they'd be interested in it. All right, wrapping up. One more connection, and then a final talk about land conservation in this country. Someday in 93 or 94, my phone rang, and there was a message, and I played the message back. And the message was, hi, Steve, this is Paul Rampell. I'm a lawyer in Palm Beach. I may want to retain you to help out with my client, Donald Trump, who wants to do a preservation easement on the Mar-a-Lago estate. Call me back, so forth. And I listened to the message, and I said, who is that, really? I mean, is that like a high school classmate or a college friend, or who's playing a joke on me? And I called Paul back, and long story short, I ended up going to work for Trump and helped write the preservation easement on Mar-a-Lago, which is a serious historic preservation easement held by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And I met him in New York early on, met Trump early on, and I said to him, I want an inscribed copy of one of your books. And he said, well, I want an inscribed copy of one of your books. When Paul introduced me to Trump, he said, the thing you have to remember about Donald is that everything with him is a negotiation, so just file that away. So anyway, that's where I got back this inscribed Trump, The Art of the Deal, to Steve Small, a truly great tax lawyer. Thank you for your help on Mar-a-Lago. And truly is spelled Truely. like tap is spelled TAPP. So one more to wind it up, Trump-related story. In the early days, one of the books in the collection here is on Mount Greylock in the Berkshires, and that's inscribed to me by George Wislocky, who was sort of the pioneer in the Berkshires in land conservation. And one of my early trips out there, George introduced me to Norris Phelps, who is a dairy farmer that had a 900-acre farm in Williamstown, Massachusetts, the second largest landowner in Williamstown behind Williams College. And he said, Norris, if you ever need a good lawyer, protect your property, call Steve. And 5 or 6 years or however many years later, Norris called me, The local land trust and the state and some various agencies had put a very complicated deal together, threw money into the pot. We're buying a couple of pieces outright. We're buying conservation easements on some of your land. Complicated. Long story short, the deal closed. It was a great deal, very satisfactory deal. They had a celebration, dedication, once this was all done, that I was invited to. The governor came and a couple of state people and land trust people, and I couldn't make it because I was actually, at the time, really in Chattanooga, working with the Davenport family. Now, remember before I said, remember the name Ben Pierce, who set me up with the David Love autograph? Ben Pierce called me and said, I've got a college classmate whose family owns some land on a mountain outside of Chattanooga, and they really need your help. Can you help them? And I said, sure. And I ended up working with the Davenport family. They've established Lula Lake Land Trust, a wonderful tax-exempt organization in the area. One of them got out of the family business and went into land conservation as a business. But I happened to be doing some work with them in Chattanooga during the Norris Phelps dedication. Why is he telling this story? I'll get to the punchline in a minute. And the woman who ran the local land trust that put the deal together said to everybody, you know, we're really glad that Steve was able to work with Norris Phelps because he's really been very busy. At the time he was working with Norris, he was also working for Donald Trump. And Norris Phelps, who gave new meaning to the term curmudgeon, was sitting there, and Nan said at the time he was working for Norris, he was working for Donald Trump, and Norris piped up, yeah, and he sent me Trump's bill. Except Norris paid all of his bill. Last comment, and it's looking forward. My latest book over there is very different, The Business of Open Space, What's Next. The Preserving Family Lands books are primers on how to do conservation easements and the tax issues and so forth. Private land conservation in this country, the basis of everything that you all talk about all the time, I think, arguably, is protected land. Air quality, water quality, habitat, places for critters, open space, clean whatever. The conservation business in this country has thrived for the last 30 years based on conservation easements and government funding. And I don't think the pace of growth can continue with reliance on just conservation easements and government funding. And I see as the next wave, and I'm just starting to see a little bit more and a little bit more, ways to find transactions that bring in private capital to protect environmental assets by monetizing some of the resources associated with an acre of land, like carbon credits. Okay, I can't give you a long list because there isn't a long list yet, but we could have water credits. I think in Monterey County there are water credits. We could have green credits. We could have habitat credits where private money goes in and buys up most of the bundle of rights from a private landowner, and then, as my friends who are in the business in this say, disaggregate those rights and sell them off into the private marketplace. And when I first heard what they were doing, I thought, this is brilliant, because in the conservation business, we've historically thought about land as protecting land by extinguishing development rights, by getting rid of all of those other things that you can do to raise money from your property other than what it is you're doing. And this is turning that around. Every single acre of land has a number of resources associated with it that could someday be monetized. The markets don't exist yet, except for carbon credits and scattered in some other places. I'll give you one example of a deal these guys I know in Virginia put together. There was extra water in a particular basin in Arkansas, and they bought all this extra water cheap. And then they went to a lot of the farmers in the area and they said, here's what you're paying for water now. We will sell you water for this. Look at the savings to you, but we want to acquire some of that bundle of rights from you. Not any rights that are going to interfere with your farming and agriculture activities. Not going to interfere with hunting and fishing and recreation. But other rights, and we're going to bank those rights until we can find markets or make markets for them. And I think they wrapped up 100,000 acres that way. Completely different way of thinking. So that's about the end. Again, a lot more stuff in my collection, and I don't want to talk about my career anymore, but I'm grateful to be able to be here today, and I'm grateful to find a home for my collection, which means a lot to me. Every time I go through the inventory, I think, God, I can't believe I actually had that book. So thank you. I assume no questions, but if anybody wants to ask a question, do we have time for a question? Or am I cutting into the reception?
It is, but we have time for questions, reception.
I'll be around.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
But we want to say we're really so glad that your book's found a home here, too. Because when we look at the books, Fritz and I thought they were really incredibly special. So we thank you so much.